A powerful mafia boss was about to lose his entire empire because of a few lines of writing that no one could decipher, until a dishwasher that nobody ever bothered to notice finally spoke up and shattered the silence. What happened next left everyone in the room completely speechless. Before we begin today's story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. We truly appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy the story. Dante Falcone slammed a weathered leather notebook onto the heavy wooden table, surrounded by his most trusted men. His cold, steel-gray eyes swept slowly across the private dining room of Vittoria Restaurant. Outside, the rain drifted endlessly over the Mississippi River in New Orleans. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of red wine and unmistakable fear. "Can anyone here read this damn thing?" he asked, his voice low and icy. The notebook had belonged to Enzo, his loyal accountant who had died under deeply suspicious circumstances. Hidden within those pages, covered in strange symbols and cryptic markings, was the location of $12 million, along with the identity of the traitor hiding inside the family itself. Vincent, Dante's right-hand man, quietly cleared his throat before explaining that they had already hired 3 of the finest code-breaking experts available, and every one of them had failed. Dante let out a dry, humorless laugh, then made an offer that froze the entire room. "Anyone who can read this notebook before tonight is over will get $500,000. A few rough chuckles echoed through the room, because everyone knew that even the sharpest minds had already admitted defeat. Then, from the darkest corner of the room, where a young woman in a wrinkled work uniform had been silently mopping the floor, a calm voice quietly broke the silence. "I can read it." Every head turned toward Nora Quinn, the dishwasher and janitor whom no one had cared enough to remember after months of seeing her every day. She gently set her mop aside, walked toward the table, glanced over a few lines with her tired yet piercing blue-gray eyes, then lifted her gaze and looked directly at the mafia boss with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. What could have allowed a poor dishwasher to solve a code that even the world's most expensive experts couldn't crack? And why would someone with such extraordinary talent choose to bury herself beneath endless stacks of dirty dishes and a simple mop? Stay with us, and together we'll uncover the answers. The room remained wrapped in silence as Nora leaned over the notebook, her fingers gliding across the tangled symbols that had forced the 3 experts before her to give up. To everyone else, it looked like nothing more than a mess of hurried handwriting mixed with meaningless numbers. But beneath her blue-gray eyes, the scattered markings slowly fell into a pattern that was chillingly familiar. She spoke softly, her voice as steady as if she were reading an ordinary business report. Enzo hadn't used the kind of code favored by people in the criminal underworld. Instead, he had relied on an accounting notation system, a private language known only to those who were accustomed to hiding money inside financial records. The tiny dots beside each number weren't there for decoration. They marked concealed transfers, while the abbreviated letters represented the shortened names of intermediary accounts. She paused when she reached a line that had been underlined twice. Then she looked up and explained that the $12 million wasn't hidden in a single place. It had been divided into smaller amounts and concealed through 3 different layers of intermediary accounts. Whoever had designed that system understood the auditing process inside and out, well enough to know exactly where investigators would search, and deliberately avoided those very places. Vincent let out a mocking laugh. Folding his arms as he leaned against the wall, he sneered that it was ridiculous for everyone in the room to stand there listening to a dishwasher lecture them about things she didn't even understand. Maybe she was just reading a few random words and making up a story that sounded convincing enough to earn herself the reward. But Dante didn't laugh. He simply lifted one hand slightly from the table, a gesture so small it was almost impossible to notice, yet it was enough to make Vincent fall silent immediately, and the entire room held its breath. Dante's gray eyes never left the young woman. He studied her carefully, weighing every word, searching for even the slightest trace of deception, something he had become an expert at recognizing after spending years surrounded by people who lied as naturally as they breathed. He found nothing. She stood there with perfect posture, her hands still carrying the faint scent of dish soap, her expression so remarkably calm that solving a notebook which had defeated the finest minds seemed no more extraordinary than finishing the last corner of a freshly mopped floor. Slowly, he asked what she wanted. Without the slightest hesitation, Nora answered that she wanted exactly what he had promised in front of everyone: $500,000, not 1 penny more, and not 1 penny less. Vincent was about to interrupt again, but one glance from Dante forced the words back down his throat. Dante frowned, his voice growing even lower as he asked whether she understood what she had just demanded, and from whom she was demanding it, because that amount had been spoken in anger. It had been a challenge, not a promise. Nora met his eyes without looking away. She replied that she had heard every single word he said, and a man in his position surely understood that words spoken before the entire family should carry far more weight than that. Something shifted in Dante's eyes. It wasn't anger. It was the unmistakable focus of a predator who had suddenly realized that the person standing before him was far from ordinary. He asked her name, and that alone caused several of his men to exchange uneasy glances, because it had been a very long time since they had seen their boss ask a servant for a name, and even longer since anyone had stood before him without the slightest tremble in their voice. She told him her name was Nora Quinn. Then she quietly added that for the past several months she had been cleaning this very room every single night, after meetings like this had ended, after everyone else had gone home, when nobody ever paid any attention to the cleaning woman who stayed behind. She paused for a moment before speaking again. People always forgot one very simple truth. The ones they believed were invisible were still standing there, still listening, and still remembering every single word people spoke when they believed no one was there to hear them. The following morning, before the pale New Orleans sunlight had fully pierced the thin veil of mist drifting above the river, Dante walked into the kitchen of Vittoria, where Nora was quietly stacking freshly washed plates onto the shelves. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. He simply stood there in his dark suit, surrounded by the scent of soap and rising steam, looking as out of place as a razor-sharp knife forgotten inside the wrong kitchen drawer. He spoke plainly, without wasting a single word. He told her he wanted her to decipher the entire notebook, not just one section, but every line, every symbol, until he knew exactly where the $12 million had been hidden and who had concealed them. Nora placed the last plate onto the shelf, wiped her hands on her apron, then turned to face him with the same quiet composure he had already come to recognize. She told him she'd do it, but she had conditions. Dante raised an eyebrow slightly. In his world, people didn't set conditions for him. They begged, or they obeyed. She said her first condition was that he had to pay her the way he would pay any expert, according to the work, and according to its true value, instead of tossing her a few bills as though he were offering charity to someone worthy of pity. She told him she didn't need his sympathy. She never had, and she'd never needed anyone else's either. If there was even the smallest trace of pity in the way he looked at her, she'd rather return to washing stacks of dirty dishes than accept it. Her second condition came more slowly. For the first time, a thread of tension slipped quietly into her voice, as delicate as silk. She told him he mustn't ever go near her younger brother. He mustn't allow anyone in his world to learn that the boy even existed, and he mustn't allow anything she did for him to touch so much as a single hair on her brother's head. Dante stood in silence, studying her for a long moment, before asking why someone capable of reading what even the most highly paid specialists couldn't decipher would end up washing dishes in a restaurant like this. Nora answered with a sentence so brief it was almost cold. She needed a place that paid in cash, paid consistently every week, and most importantly, never asked questions about her past. She explained that when she'd come looking for work several months earlier, the sign outside had simply advertised an Italian restaurant looking for a cleaner. She hadn't known who owned it. She hadn't known where those heavy wooden doors truly led, and she hadn't cared enough to ask, because to her, a job was simply a job. She admitted that it wasn't until the previous night, when he'd thrown that notebook onto the table, that she'd finally understood exactly whose floors she'd been cleaning all that time. For a brief moment, Dante almost found himself amused by her honesty, because very few people had ever dared to tell him they simply didn't care who he was. He gave a slow nod, accepting both of her conditions, then added that if she did her job well, she'd earn even more than she imagined. But just as he turned and started toward the door, his voice grew quieter. Without looking back, he told her there was one thing she needed to understand. The moment she'd opened her mouth and read from that notebook in front of everyone the previous night, she'd stopped being invisible. And in his world, once someone had been seen, they could never become invisible again. Nora remained standing alone in the middle of the kitchen as the steady sound of water dripping from the faucet echoed softly through the room. For the very first time since arriving in this city, she understood with perfect clarity that the door behind her had just closed, and that she'd crossed a line from which there'd be no path leading back. That night, after her shift was over, Nora returned to the small apartment at the far end of a quiet street, where a little boy was waiting for her beside the window with a sketchbook resting across his knees. Sam had just turned 8. He was thinner than most children his age. His lips sometimes lost their color whenever he pushed himself too hard, yet his eyes were always bright, alive with endless questions. The moment he saw his sister walk through the door, he called out happily, greeting her as Captain, the nickname he'd given her ever since the days when the two of them had spent hours drawing imaginary maps of distant lands that no one had ever explored. Nora sat down beside him and admired the newest map he'd drawn, an island with a lonely lighthouse and a small boat cutting through the waves. Then, she gently ran her fingers through his messy hair as her heart quietly tightened inside her chest. On the old wooden table in the corner of the room, the stack of papers from the hospital remained exactly where she'd left them. She couldn't bring herself to open them again, because she'd already memorized every number printed across those pages. Sam had been born with a congenital heart defect, and the doctors had made one thing painfully clear. He needed a major heart operation, a surgery whose cost alone was nearly $80,000, without even counting the long months of care and treatment that would follow. They'd also told her something that stole her sleep night after night. That tiny heart couldn't keep waiting forever. Every month that passed made the danger even greater, and if the surgery didn't happen within the coming months, everything would slip beyond anyone's ability to save. For a dishwasher like her, that amount of money was a mountain far too high to climb on a weekly paycheck. That was the reason she couldn't refuse the offer made by the man in the dark suit, even though she understood perfectly well that the true price of accepting it might be far greater than $500,000. Sam looked up at his sister and gently asked whether she'd had a tiring day. Then, with the innocent voice of a child who somehow sounded far older than his years because hospitals had become such a familiar part of his life, he quietly told her he knew something was worrying her, because whenever she smiled without her eyes smiling too, it always meant something was wrong. Nora let out a soft laugh, a laugh filled with love and quiet heartbreak. She wrapped her arms around him and lied, telling him nothing was wrong at all. She said the captain's arms were simply a little tired after a long day, and that she'd found a new job that paid much better, enough for the two of them to finally have the future they'd been dreaming about. Sam believed every word she said, the way a child believes the only person he has left in the world. Then he whispered that once his heart had been repaired, the very first thing he wanted to do was travel somewhere far away with her, to a place where there was a real ocean, so they could set afloat the little boat he'd drawn so many times in his pictures. Nora held him just a little tighter, resting her chin gently against his soft hair. In the darkness of the tiny apartment, she silently made a promise to herself that no matter what kind of world she had to step into, no matter what price she'd have to pay, she'd find a way to buy enough time for that little heart, before the invisible clock counting down one day after another reached the moment she couldn't bear to imagine. A few days later, Nora was summoned to the private room above the restaurant, not to clean, but to sit quietly in the corner and begin the work of deciphering the notebook. It was during one afternoon like that she accidentally witnessed something a dishwasher should never have been allowed to hear. Dante was meeting with several of his most trusted men to review a shipping deal moving through the port, a major contract that, once signed, would send an enormous amount of money flowing through the family's hands. The man responsible for the financial records presented the figures with complete confidence and flawless precision. Every head in the room nodded in approval, including Vincent, who stood beside Dante wearing the satisfied expression of someone expecting everything to unfold exactly as planned. Nora had no intention of speaking. She'd learned long ago that silence was the safest armor a person could wear, but when her eyes drifted across the document lying nearby, the numbers rearranged themselves inside her mind almost instinctively, a reflex shaped by years she had long tried to leave behind. In an instant, she realized something wasn't right. She hesitated for only a brief moment before quietly speaking up. She explained that there was an error in the way the currency exchange allocation and intermediary fees had been calculated. If they signed the agreement using the figures being presented, the family wouldn't make the profit they believed they would. Instead, they'd quietly suffer a substantial loss, carefully concealed beneath layers of hidden fees that the other party had deliberately built into the contract. The entire room fell silent at once. Every eye turned toward the young woman in the wrinkled work uniform. The accountant's face flushed as he immediately protested, insisting he'd checked every calculation with great care and asking what a cleaning woman could possibly know about financial figures on this scale. But Dante didn't say a word. He simply motioned for the document, placed it in front of Nora, then, with the same cold expression he'd always worn, told her to point out the exact mistake. Nora stepped forward and picked up a pen, speaking calmly, without the slightest hint of showing off. She worked through the document line by line, separating every individual expense and identifying precisely where certain numbers had been deliberately rounded. She pointed out where a tiny percentage had been quietly repeated across multiple layers until it had grown into a significant amount that no one had noticed. She explained that the hidden loss was large enough to erase the entire profit from the deal, and that whoever had drafted the contract understood exactly what they were doing. They were counting on the fact that no one would have the patience to trace the calculations all the way to the final layer. When she finally set the pen back down, the room became utterly silent. The accountant had gone pale because he couldn't find a single argument to challenge what she'd just demonstrated. Dante studied the document for a long moment before lifting his eyes to hers. For a brief instant, something appeared in those steel-gray eyes that he rarely allowed anyone to see. It was respect. Quietly, he said that she'd just saved the family an amount of money far greater than the reward he'd promised her. From that moment on, no one in the room ever dared to look at her as though she were merely a servant again. Only Vincent was different. He didn't object. He didn't show any anger. He simply stood there with his arms folded, a faint smile resting on his lips that never reached his eyes. Then, as the others began quietly discussing what had happened, he casually remarked that it was certainly interesting how a young woman who had seemingly appeared from nowhere just happened to possess such remarkable mastery of numbers. Sometimes, he said, people who were far too intelligent for the position they occupied turned out to be the most dangerous of all. After saying that, he turned and walked away, but his eyes lingered on Nora for one heartbeat longer than necessary, a look that observed, remembered, and quietly tucked everything away. Although no one realized it at the time, that was the very first moment a silent seed of suspicion took root inside the heart of the man standing closest to the Mafia boss. Dante's curiosity about that remarkable woman continued to grow, until one evening he summoned Marcus, his most loyal bodyguard, and the only man he trusted with matters that required complete discretion, and instructed him to find out everything there was to know about Nora Quinn. Marcus accepted the order without asking why, and only a few days later he placed a thin file on his boss's desk, one that was slender in size, yet contained enough information to make Dante read it more than once. It turned out that the dishwasher in the wrinkled uniform had once been a name spoken with genuine respect throughout the financial world. A gifted young forensic accountant who'd been regarded as one of the brightest rising stars at a prestigious firm. A woman with an extraordinary talent for tracing hidden streams of money and making sense of numbers that looked like nothing but chaos to everyone else. Marcus explained that she'd once worked on highly complex cases, that organizations had competed for her expertise, and that an extraordinary future had seemed to stretch endlessly before her. Then, without warning, about 2 years earlier, her name had disappeared completely from every professional record. There'd been no explanation at all, as though she'd deliberately erased herself from her former life, in order to become someone the world would never notice again. There was a mysterious gap of 2 years that Marcus hadn't been able to fill, a strange silence separating the brilliant woman described in the file from the cleaning woman mopping the floors for Dante's family, and that empty space only deepened Dante's questions. But what finally moved him to act wasn't his curiosity. It was a small detail Marcus mentioned almost in passing, that the young woman was carrying the crushing weight of enormous hospital bills. That night, Dante sat alone for a very long time. Then he did something he couldn't completely explain even to himself. Quietly and without telling anyone, he arranged for the most urgent portion of those hospital expenses to be paid directly through the hospital, just enough to keep the situation from becoming worse. Not the entire amount, not the surgery itself. Only a small measure of relief standing between that family and the edge of the cliff. He believed he'd handled everything discreetly, that no one would ever know, least of all Nora herself. But he was wrong. Only 2 days later, Nora appeared outside his office. She didn't knock. She didn't wait to be invited inside. Clutched tightly in her hand was the notice from the hospital, and for the very first time since he'd met her, the calm shell she'd always worn cracked open, revealing the fierce anger burning beneath it. She slammed the paper onto his desk, her voice trembling with restrained emotion as she demanded to know what he thought he was doing. Who had given him the right to interfere in her private life? Who had given him the right to investigate her younger brother after promising that he'd never involve the boy in anything? Dante answered calmly that he'd only been trying to help, that to him the money meant almost nothing, and that she didn't have to carry every burden by herself. But those words only poured more fuel onto the fire. Nora told him she didn't need kindness handed down like charity. She didn't need someone using money to buy the comforting illusion that he was some noble savior. She'd survived all those years with nothing but these 2 hands, and she didn't owe anyone anything. She said she knew exactly the kind of man he was, a man accustomed to looking at other people as though they were puzzles waiting to be solved, broken machines waiting to be repaired, flawed things waiting for someone to rescue them so that rescuer could feel righteous about himself. Then she looked directly into his eyes, her voice dropping lower but becoming as sharp as a blade. She told him he was treating her like a project that needed fixing, but she wasn't anyone's project. She never had been, and she never would be. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the most powerful man in the city sitting alone inside his own office, one hand still resting on the paper she'd thrown onto his desk, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to say to someone he couldn't buy, couldn't command, and couldn't truly understand. A few days later, when the work of deciphering the notebook required Nora to compare several financial documents that could only be obtained during a private meeting, Dante took her to an elegant restaurant in the heart of the old quarter, where crystal chandeliers cast their warm glow across tables draped in immaculate white linens, and the gentle melody of a piano drifted softly through the quiet conversations of the city's elite. Nora walked in wearing the simplest outfit she owned, her back straight and her chin held high. Although she made no effort whatsoever to draw anyone's attention, the contrast between her and the glittering elegance surrounding her was enough to attract more than a few curious glances. At the neighboring table, a woman adorned with expensive jewelry leaned toward her companion and, in a voice just loud enough for others to hear, remarked that these days, people seemed willing to let just anyone into places like this, and that some people clearly didn't belong in such surroundings, no matter how hard they tried to appear respectable. Nora heard every word. She always did, yet she merely tightened her grip on the napkin resting across her lap, and kept her expression perfectly calm, because she'd heard remarks like those so many times that they no longer possessed the power to make her bleed. Dante, however, reacted differently. He set his wineglass down, slowly turned toward the neighboring table, and with nothing more than a single glance as cold as forged steel, every trace of laughter there disappeared instantly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound his fist on the table. His tone remained low and remarkably composed as he said that the woman sitting beside him possessed one of the sharpest minds he'd ever had the privilege of working with. She'd accomplished things that an entire room full of people who considered themselves brilliant had failed to do. Before passing judgment on someone else, perhaps people ought to ask themselves whether they'd ever accomplished even a fraction of what she had. The woman's face flushed deep red before turning pale. She stammered a few embarrassed words, then quickly looked away, while the entire dining room around them settled into a respectful silence born from the unmistakable presence of a man many of those seated there already knew by reputation. Nora remained quietly in her chair. When she finally looked up at him, an unfamiliar feeling rose gently inside her, one she'd refused to let herself experience for a very long time. It was the feeling of having someone stand in front of her and shield her. For that single moment, beneath the warm golden lights, the distance separating the two of them seemed to grow just a little smaller, and something unexpectedly gentle flickered across the eyes that were almost always so cold as he quietly told her that she didn't deserve to endure words like those. She never had, yet just as her heart threatened to soften, Nora was the one who stepped back. She gently placed her glass of water onto the table, and, her voice returning to its familiar steady calm, thanked him for speaking on her behalf. But she told him he didn't need to do that, and he shouldn't do it again. She explained that she understood perfectly well where the line between them had always been. She was there to do a job, to repay what she owed, and then to leave. Anything beyond that line would only bring pain to both of them. Then she admitted, so quietly that the words were almost meant for him alone, that she wasn't afraid of poverty. She wasn't afraid of hardship. The only thing that truly terrified her was allowing someone to come close enough to hurt her all over again. Finally, she turned her eyes toward the window where night was slowly settling over the river, and said there were some doors that, once they'd been closed, were better left closed forever, because she'd learned through blood and tears that the most beautiful things she'd ever been given in life had always been the very things taken away from her with the greatest cruelty. It happened on a rainy night. Dante was in the middle of one of the most important negotiations he'd had in months. A meeting he'd waited a very long time for, and simply couldn't afford to miss, when his phone vibrated with the name of his bodyguard flashing across the screen. Marcus told him there was an emergency involving the young woman. Her younger brother had suddenly taken a turn for the worse and had been rushed to the hospital. Nora was completely overwhelmed and had no idea how she could possibly get there in time that night. Dante didn't hesitate for even a single second. He rose from the negotiation table while their business partners stared at him in stunned disbelief. In a calm voice, he announced that the meeting would have to be postponed, then walked straight out the door without paying the slightest attention to the desperate attempts to stop him or the enormous fortune hanging in the balance. He drove himself through the rain-soaked streets of the city, picked Nora up, then raced toward the hospital. Throughout the entire drive, she sat beside him with both hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her lips moved silently, whispering prayers no one else could hear. Dante said nothing. He simply pressed harder on the accelerator. For the first time in his life, he placed one fragile human life above all the numbers he'd spent his entire life pursuing. Much later, when the doctors finally stepped out to tell them that the little boy had survived the crisis, and his condition had been stabilized, Nora seemed to collapse onto one of the chairs in the hallway. Her entire body trembled with overwhelming relief. Dante quietly sat down beside her and handed her a cup of warm water without saying a single word. It was in that moment of complete exhaustion and vulnerability, when every wall she'd spent years building had crumbled beneath the weight of fear, that Nora finally began to speak. Her voice was hoarse as she told him something she hadn't told another soul in the past 2 years. She said she hadn't always been a dishwasher. There'd once been a time when she'd worn perfectly tailored business suits and walked into towering glass office buildings every morning, working for a financial firm called Blackwood and Vance, one of the most powerful names in the industry, a company that beneath its polished appearance was, as she quietly described it, a place where nearly every stream of dirty money in the entire city eventually found its way. She explained that while tracing financial records, she'd accidentally uncovered a truth she'd never been meant to discover. The firm had been laundering enormous amounts of money for some of the most powerful people imaginable. When she'd brought the evidence forward, believing justice would stand beside her, what she'd received wasn't protection, it was destruction. They accused her of crimes she hadn't committed. They fabricated lies claiming she was the dishonest one. They drove her out of the profession she'd devoted herself to. They destroyed her reputation so completely that not a single company was willing to hire her. With nothing more than the words of wealthy and influential people, they'd transformed the whistleblower into the criminal. Then she fell silent for a very long time, her eyes fixed on the empty space before her. Finally, in a sentence so brief it carried unbearable sorrow, she said that only a short time afterward, her parents had died in what had officially been called an accident, something she'd never been able to believe was simply a coincidence. From that day forward, she said, she'd come to understand that her talent wasn't a gift at all, it was a curse. That extraordinary ability to read hidden truths inside numbers had stolen everything she'd ever loved. So she'd buried it as deeply as she possibly could. She'd abandoned her identity in exchange for invisibility. Holding tightly to her little brother, the only family she had left in the world, she'd fled to this city and accepted a life spent scrubbing floors and washing dishes, simply to exist without anyone knowing who she really was. She said she'd sworn she'd never allow those numbers to drag her back into that old nightmare again. Yet now she was sitting there deciphering a notebook for a Mafia boss because her little brother's fragile heart couldn't wait any longer. Dante listened to every word in complete silence. When she'd finished, he didn't offer a single empty word of comfort. He simply looked at her for a long time as a strange feeling rose quietly inside him, one he'd never before found a name for, because for reasons he couldn't yet explain, the name Blackwood and Vance echoed through his memory like the distant ringing of a bell, warning him that it meant something he still hadn't fully understood. Over the following days, Nora buried herself in Enzo's notebook, with a level of concentration that bordered on desperation, because the deeper she traced the maze of cryptic symbols, the more she felt an unshakable sense of dread tightening around her, as though the hand of the past were reaching out from those pages to seize her wrist once again. Enzo had been a man obsessed with caution. He'd never written anything directly. Instead, he'd broken every truth into tiny fragments and scattered them across dozens of pages, forcing anyone who attempted to read the notebook to piece everything together like an intricate puzzle that only someone fluent in the language of accounting could ever hope to solve. Then, when the final piece finally slipped into place, Nora sat motionless before the notebook for a very long time. Her hands turned ice cold, because what emerged before her was far more horrifying than anything she'd imagined. The notebook didn't merely reveal the location of the $12 million. It was a silent indictment, a secret testimony Enzo had painstakingly assembled before his death, and the name that stood out more clearly than any other throughout the entire web of betrayal wasn't the name of some distant stranger. It was Vincent, the trusted right-hand man Dante relied upon more than anyone else. The numbers revealed that Vincent had secretly formed an alliance with the Delacroix family, the rival organization Dante had spent years struggling to contain. For months, Vincent had quietly been bleeding the family dry, funneling enormous sums of money into the hands of the enemy, while preparing the ground for a complete takeover. But what truly left Nora frozen in disbelief wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the path the dirty money had traveled. As she carefully traced every intermediary layer, every shell account, and every phantom company, they all converged at a single destination, one name she'd spent the last 2 years desperately trying to bury forever: Blackwood and Vance. In that instant, it felt as though the entire room had begun spinning around her. She suddenly understood a truth so chilling it stole her breath. The financial firm that had destroyed her life, stolen her career, shattered her reputation, and taken away her parents, had never been a single isolated enemy. It had been a machine, a central hub through which the dirty money of the most powerful people in the city inevitably flowed. That was why Vincent's decision to launder the stolen money through that firm wasn't some extraordinary coincidence. It was the natural outcome of how the system worked, because anyone operating in the criminal underworld who wanted to hide money eventually found themselves using the very same place. Nora remained seated there, her trembling hands slowly turning the pages once again, while inside her mind 2 separate lives that had always seemed completely unrelated suddenly locked together into one terrifying picture. The people who'd quietly arranged for her destruction years earlier, the ones who'd ordered her to be silenced, and the man now betraying the Mafia boss she'd been working for, were all nothing more than gears inside the very same machine. Every one of them was connected through the same network. At that moment, she finally understood that her own tragic fate and Dante's deadly struggle for survival had never truly been separate stories at all. She remembered the calculating look Vincent had given her that day in the meeting room, the thin smile that had never reached his eyes, and a cold shiver ran through her as she realized he'd probably already begun to feel uneasy. He'd sensed the danger she represented, because among everyone in the world, she alone possessed the ability to decipher that notebook and drag him into the light. That night, sitting alone beneath the pale yellow glow of a single lamp with the notebook lying open before her, Nora realized she wasn't holding only the secret capable of saving a Mafia empire. She was also holding the key that could unlock the very case that had buried her own life beneath years of silence. She also understood that the moment she revealed the truth, there'd be no path back for anyone involved, because two destinies had become bound together inside the same relentless machine, and that machine would stop only when one side had been completely crushed beneath its wheels. Before deciding to reveal everything, Nora needed a little more time to think, and perhaps that was why fate granted the three of them one rare peaceful evening, one small moment of stillness that, when she looked back on it years later, she'd remember as the last ray of sunshine before the storm. Sam had recovered enough to return home, and that evening, Dante stopped by their small apartment, not as a Mafia boss, but simply as an invited guest, carrying a paper bag filled with dinner and a brand new box of colored pencils for the little boy. Sam was usually cautious around strangers, yet for reasons no one could explain, he quickly grew fond of this quiet man. The boy pulled Dante down to sit with him on the floor, spread out his imaginary maps, and excitedly told him about the island with the lighthouse and the little boat that would one day carry him and his sister across a real ocean. Dante listened with a patience that surprised even himself. From time to time, he'd ask a question that sent the little boy into bursts of joyful laughter. Nora leaned quietly against the kitchen doorway, watching the scene unfold before her. Her heart was filled with both warmth and a quiet ache of fear, because she knew better than anyone that beautiful moments like this had never stayed very long in her life. They shared dinner beneath the warm golden glow of the lights inside the tiny apartment, surrounded by easy laughter. And for a fleeting moment, the man who'd spent his life surrounded by cold calculation and bloodshed looked almost like an ordinary man, someone who might truly belong inside a simple home like this. When Sam finally drifted off to sleep in his chair with the box of colored pencils still resting in his arms, Dante quietly rose to leave. At the doorway, he paused and looked at Nora before softly admitting that it had been a very long time since he'd experienced an evening like this, an evening during which he'd completely forgotten who he was. Nora simply smiled without answering. But after the door closed behind him, and the sound of his footsteps gradually disappeared into the night, she remained standing there for a long time, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to hold on to the fragile warmth that had briefly touched her life, never realizing that out there, hidden within the darkness beyond her door, the gears of betrayal had already begun to turn, and the storm about to descend would sweep away every trace of peace that this precious night had just given them. But Vincent hadn't survived for so many years in the criminal underworld through luck alone. He'd survived because he possessed the razor-sharp instincts of a predator that could sense danger long before it fully emerged, and he'd already realized that the dishwasher was getting far too close to the truth that could destroy him. Rather than waiting to be dragged into the light, he decided to strike first. His attack wasn't aimed at Nora through violence. Instead, he chose a far more poisonous weapon. He aimed directly at her past. For several days, he quietly dug through every trace of her history, and through the connections he'd maintained within the very Blackwood and Vance network itself, he easily obtained the complete files from the case that had shattered her life years earlier. Then, with the practiced hands of a man who'd spent years twisting truth into lies, he reshaped every detail into an entirely different story. Overnight, newspaper articles began appearing everywhere, and the name Nora Quinn, the name she'd buried for the past 2 years, was suddenly dragged back beneath the spotlight. But this time she wasn't portrayed as a courageous whistleblower who'd been wrongfully destroyed. She was painted as a dangerous fraud, a financial specialist who'd supposedly been fired for manipulating company records. A clever woman who'd built her life by slipping into places where money flowed so she could exploit them for personal gain. The truth had been turned completely upside down. The guilty had become the victims, while the victim herself had been transformed into the criminal. The cruelest part of all was that the greatest pain of her entire life had now been sharpened into the very knife used to stab her in the back. Vincent didn't stop there. He carefully allowed those same accusations to reach the police, reopening an investigation everyone had believed was long finished and placing Nora back under the scrutiny of law enforcement once again. But the most devastating blow he delivered wasn't aimed at the authorities. It was aimed at the family itself, because he understood that if he wanted to eliminate Nora, he first had to destroy the only shield protecting her, Dante. Vincent approached his boss wearing the concerned expression of a devoted and loyal subordinate. He placed the newspaper articles on the desk, then, with a voice as smooth as honey yet filled with poison, quietly planted a seed of doubt inside Dante's mind. He remarked how remarkably strange it was that someone with such a suspicious past had appeared inside their restaurant at precisely the right moment. How unbelievably convenient it was that she'd possessed exactly the skills needed to decipher the family's most valuable notebook. Perhaps, Vincent suggested, she'd never been an ordinary dishwasher at all. Perhaps she'd been an agent planted long ago by their enemies, patiently working her way into the very heart of the organization. He delivered every sentence slowly, allowing each one enough time to settle deep inside Dante's thoughts. Vincent knew exactly where to strike, because throughout his entire life of bloodshed and ruthless calculation, the thing Dante hated and feared more than anything else was betrayal. And despite desperately wanting not to believe it, Dante felt a tiny crack slowly spreading through the trust he'd placed in her. Life had taught him through far too many painful losses that the people he allowed closest to him were often the ones capable of inflicting the deepest wounds. He remembered the effortless way Nora had read those impossible numbers. He remembered how she'd appeared at precisely the moment the family had needed someone capable of deciphering the notebook. For the very first time, he found himself wondering whether any of it had truly been coincidence at all. When he summoned her to confront her, the warmth that had filled his eyes during that quiet evening in the small apartment was gone. His gaze had returned to its familiar coldness, sharp and searching. Nora needed only one look into those eyes to understand exactly what had happened. She didn't even have the chance to defend herself. She didn't have the chance to explain that those newspaper articles were the real lies, because she instantly realized she'd been trapped inside the very same snare that had crushed her years before. The only difference was that this time, the man setting the trap was standing right beside the man she'd finally begun to trust. Standing alone in that room beneath a circle of suspicious eyes, Nora understood that everything had changed. The secret she'd uncovered had transformed her into a target, and the real battle, the battle to reclaim both the truth and her own life, had only just begun. Vincent understood that planting doubt in Dante's mind alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to turn that doubt into action, and to accomplish that, he called a meeting of the family's most influential leaders, the men who controlled its major operations, men whose voices carried enough weight to shake the foundations of an empire. Inside the sealed room, where countless life-changing decisions had been made over the years, Vincent rose to his feet, wearing the expression of a man burdened by an unbearable responsibility. Then he began weaving his carefully crafted story. He warned that the family was facing a threat unlike anything it had ever encountered before. A stranger with a deeply tainted past had found her way into the innermost circle and now possessed secrets capable of sending every one of them to prison. Skillfully, he reminded them of the newspaper articles, exaggerated the danger they supposedly represented, then lowered his voice and declared that what pained him most wasn't the arrival of an outsider. It was the fact that the very man they'd all chosen to follow, the man they'd trusted with their lives, had allowed himself to be blinded by a woman, placing his personal feelings above the safety and survival of the entire family. Those words fell like poisonous seeds onto ground, already hardened by fear, and Dante watched the expressions around the table slowly begin to change. He saw suspicion spreading through the room, like oil across still water. He noticed several men beginning to nod in agreement. He watched the eyes of those who'd once bowed their heads before him now fill with quiet calculation. Vincent finally presented his demand with absolute certainty. The young woman had to be removed from everything immediately. The notebook had to be handed over to someone else. And if necessary, she should be dealt with according to the unforgiving laws of their world, to ensure there'd never be another leak. Every eye in the room turned toward Dante, waiting for him to nod, because under ordinary circumstances, no mafia boss would have risked an entire empire for the sake of one unknown woman. But Dante didn't nod. Slowly, he rose to his feet. In the same calm, cold voice everyone knew so well, he reminded them that the very woman they were so eager to eliminate was the one who'd saved the family an enormous fortune they'd otherwise have lost. She was the only person capable of reading the notebook that 3 of the most expensive experts had failed to decipher. And if there truly was a traitor sitting somewhere in that room, then it certainly wasn't the dishwasher. It was one of the people seated around that very table. His words struck the room like a knife thrown straight through its center. Vincent immediately fought back, raising his voice with carefully manufactured outrage. He declared that their leader had changed, that because of one woman he was now willing to turn his back on the brothers who'd stood beside him through countless years, and that this alone proved his judgment had become so clouded it could no longer be trusted. The atmosphere inside the room became suffocatingly heavy, stretched as tightly as a rope about to snap. Hands quietly drifted closer to concealed weapons. Eyes moved back and forth between the 2 men facing one another. In that moment, everyone understood that one careless word, or one unnecessary movement, could send blood spilling across the floor. Dante slowly looked around the table, meeting every pair of eyes in turn, and he realized a bitter truth. The balance of power had shifted. Vincent's poisonous whispers had already eaten away at the loyalty of more than half the men in that room. Now the man who'd once ruled with absolute authority stood alone inside the very empire he'd built with his own hands. Several of the family leaders quietly stepped closer to Vincent. They didn't need to say anything. Their choice had already been made. The room that had once symbolized Dante's unquestioned power now stood visibly divided into 2 opposing sides. Only Marcus stepped forward to stand behind Dante. He said nothing, yet remained as solid and unwavering as a stone wall. The bodyguard's eyes made one thing perfectly clear. Even if the rest of the world turned against Dante, he'd remain at his side. Dante understood that he'd just gambled everything. He'd placed his entire empire onto the scales, simply to protect one woman he wasn't even certain he truly understood yet. And as he walked out of that room that night, with only one man still standing beside him, he knew that the battle to reclaim both his authority and the trust of his own family would become the loneliest and most brutal war of his life. A war that, if he lost, would cost him not only his empire, but his life as well. When Nora learned that the entire family had split into 2 factions because of her, that the man had stood alone and placed his entire empire on the scales just to shield her, her heart twisted with pain, because she understood that as long as she stayed, he would keep losing more, and she couldn't allow another person to be destroyed because of her, the way her parents had been years before. The first thing she did was take Sam somewhere safe. She arranged for him to stay at the hospital under the pretense that he needed further observation after his emergency treatment. She entrusted him to Rosa, the restaurant's elderly head chef, the woman who'd loved her like a daughter, and the only person she still dared to trust. She begged Rosa to care for the boy and never tell anyone where he was. She sat beside his bed for a long time, gently brushing her fingers through his soft hair as he slept, whispering that the captain had to take care of something important, that no matter what happened he had to stay brave and believe she'd come back, because she knew she was about to walk into a place she wouldn't let her little brother enter under any circumstance, and she'd rather face every danger alone than allow even a single strand of his hair to become tangled in this storm. Once she'd made sure he was safe, Nora went to find Dante to say goodbye. She found him in his private room on a rainy night, standing silently beside the window, staring out at the dark river. She told him she was leaving the city, that she'd take Enzo's ledger and everything she knew far away so she'd no longer be the burden threatening him, that if she simply disappeared, the family would settle down, the captains would return to his side, and he'd keep everything he'd spent his life building. Dante turned to face her, and for the first time since they'd met, the cold armor he'd always worn fell away completely, revealing something a man like him had never allowed anyone to see before: hurt. He stepped closer, his voice rough as he said he didn't need that empire anymore, if the price of keeping it was losing her. That after so many years surrounded by lies and betrayal, she was the first person who'd made him feel human again, that he'd fallen in love with her, in a way he'd never believed his scarred and hardened heart could still love. His confession caught in Nora's throat. Her eyes shimmered with tears, because deep inside, she'd already given him the very feelings she'd been terrified to admit, and that was exactly why she had to leave. Softly she answered that precisely because he loved her, and because she couldn't lie to herself any longer, she had no choice but to walk away from him, because everything she'd ever loved had been ripped away by fate with unbearable cruelty, and she couldn't survive the day he became the next price demanded for her presence. Then she turned and walked into the rain, tears blending with the cold drops running down her face, leaving behind the man standing frozen in the middle of his own room. But that night Nora didn't know that watchful eyes were already waiting in the darkness outside, that Vincent had no intention of letting her leave with the deadly secret she carried, and the moment she stepped onto the deserted street, shadowy figures closed in around her. At the very last instant, a car burst through the rain, its tires sending water flying. The door swung open, and Marcus appeared just in time to pull her inside, before slamming his foot on the accelerator and racing away through the downpour, leaving the frustrated attackers behind. Inside the car, the loyal bodyguard breathed hard as he told her he wasn't taking her home, and he wasn't taking her to Dante either. He was taking her somewhere safe. When the car finally stopped in front of a discreet building, the door opened, and a woman with sharp eyes and an unmistakably calm presence stepped forward to greet her. She introduced herself as a federal agent who'd been quietly waiting for the chance to meet Nora Quinn for a very long time. Inside the discreet building, the woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Diane Vasquez invited Nora to sit down. She poured her a cup of warm water, then, in a calm voice carrying unmistakable weight, began telling a story that left the young woman stunned. Vasquez said that for the past 2 years, while Nora had believed all her efforts had been buried in vain, the seed she'd planted had never truly died. The case file she'd risked everything to bring into the light, though Blackwood and Vance had buried it beneath lies and ruined her reputation, had found its way into the hands of a federal investigative unit. It had become the very first brick laid in the foundation of a massive investigation targeting the entire money laundering network operating throughout the city. Vasquez explained that during all that time, she and her team had quietly followed every lead, patiently rebuilding each missing link, pursuing both Blackwood and the Delacroix family standing behind it. Yet they'd always lacked the one thing needed to close the case once and for all. They needed evidence powerful enough to pierce the elaborate layers of deception their enemies had built. Nora listened, and an emotion she couldn't quite name rose inside her. She realized that the sacrifice she'd always believed had been a bitter failure that had stolen everything from her had, in truth, quietly served justice in a way she'd never known. Then Vasquez spoke of something that had earned even her deepest respect. The investigative team had uncovered a remarkable clue. Before disappearing from her old life, Nora had done something only someone exceptionally intelligent and always thinking ahead would have considered. She hadn't placed all her faith in the very system that had betrayed her. Instead, she'd quietly made a complete copy of every piece of evidence she'd gathered and entrusted it to an independent attorney in a distant place, with strict instructions that it could only be opened if an official government agency requested it. For 2 years, that copy had rested untouched like a time bomb, one that even Blackwood had never known existed. Now it had become the solid foundation upon which the entire indictment could finally be rebuilt. But Vasquez admitted that even that wasn't enough. because the old evidence could expose the past, yet it couldn't reach what was happening in the present. That was when she looked directly into Nora's eyes and told her that the missing piece, the final piece needed to complete the picture, was Enzo's ledger, the one currently in Nora's possession. That ledger, with its trail of betrayal flowing through Vincent, through the Delacroix family, and converging at Blackwood, was the thread connecting the past to the present, transforming what had seemed like a cold case into a living network the law could finally tighten its grip around. Vasquez said that if Nora was willing to step forward, surrender the ledger, and testify publicly, this time everything would be different. This time she wouldn't stand alone against powerful people the way she had years before. This time, the full strength of the law would stand behind her. But she also warned her honestly that the price would be enormous, because testifying publicly meant stepping out of the shadows she'd hidden within for the past 2 years. It meant standing beneath the spotlight of an entire nation. It meant giving up forever the invisibility that had protected both her and her little brother. Nora sat in silence for a long time. In her mind, she saw the faces of her late parents. She saw Sam's clear and innocent eyes. She saw the wounded look in the eyes of the man she'd left behind in the rain. She understood that the defining moment of her life had finally arrived. She could keep running and preserve what little safety she still had, or she could rise one last time and reclaim justice, not only for herself, but for everyone whose lives had been crushed beneath that merciless machine. And when she finally lifted her head to meet Vasquez's gaze, those weary gray-blue eyes shone with a new and unshakable resolve. On the day of the hearing, it seemed as though the entire nation held its breath, watching every moment unfold on their screens. The case had become the centerpiece of every news broadcast, and inside the solemn courtroom, filled to capacity with spectators and surrounded by live television cameras, Nora walked in wearing simple clothes, her back straight and her head held high. She was no longer the janitor in a wrinkled uniform, nor the invisible woman hiding in the shadows. She was a witness standing with dignity, ready to bring into the light everything that had been buried for so many years. When she was called to testify, she didn't tremble. At first, her voice was low and composed, but with every passing moment it grew clearer and stronger, like a quiet river that nothing could stop. This time, she didn't tell her story through the shattered pain she'd revealed that night in the hospital, nor through the twisted lies her enemies had created about her. Instead, she exposed the entire network using the precise and unforgiving language of a financial expert, tracing every stream of money, every shell company, every intermediary account, reconstructing before the eyes of the nation a complete picture that no one could deny. She revealed how Blackwood and Vance had transformed itself into the central hub for laundering money for the most powerful people in the city, how it had used fraudulent contracts to move enormous amounts of dirty money, and how it had mercilessly destroyed anyone who dared uncover the truth, including the woman she'd been 2 years earlier. Then she placed Enzo's ledger on the table alongside the complete copy of the evidence she'd entrusted to the independent attorney years before. Piece by piece, every fragment came together beneath the courtroom lights, joining the past to the present with a chain that couldn't be broken. She traced the path of the stolen money, identified exactly how Vincent had secretly joined forces with the Delacroix family, how he'd drained the empire of the very man who'd trusted him, and how every one of those financial trails ultimately flowed back into the same machine that had destroyed her life. Every word she spoke was like setting another stone back into its rightful place. Every piece of evidence she presented restored justice to a truth that had been buried for far too long. The entire courtroom fell into astonished silence as the small but unshakably courageous woman stood alone against an entire network of power. Somewhere else in the city, Dante sat silently before a television screen. The man who'd spent his life surrounded by bloodshed and calculated decisions felt his chest tighten as he watched her standing there, fearless and radiant, carrying not only her own battle upon her shoulders, but also the truth that so many people had paid for with their lives. He remembered the first night she'd spoken in a room filled with powerful men. He remembered the calm look in her eyes when she'd believed herself invisible. Now the entire nation was finally seeing who she truly was, exactly as she'd long deserved. When her testimony came to an end, the evidence had become far too overwhelming for wealth or influence to conceal any longer, and the machine that had once seemed untouchable began collapsing piece by piece before the television cameras. Vincent, who'd sat there wearing his familiar expression of arrogant confidence, turned pale as every accusation echoed through the courtroom. When the federal agent stepped toward him, his carefully crafted composure shattered completely, revealing the true face of the traitor who'd finally been forced to answer for his crimes. Alongside him, the leading figures of Blackwood and the most powerful members of the Delacroix family were brought into the light one after another. An entire dark empire built upon deception and ruthless cruelty crumbled like a castle of sand beneath the unstoppable tide of justice. Yet amid all that upheaval, what finally brought tears to Nora's eyes wasn't victory. It wasn't watching her enemies fall. It was the moment she realized that after 2 long years of being branded a liar, slandered and abandoned, the world finally believed her. The truth she'd carried alone through countless lonely nights had finally been heard. The woman who'd once been treated as though she were invisible now stood in the light, seen at last, fully vindicated, and given back the dignity that should never have been taken from her in the first place. After the hearing that shook the entire nation, the machine that had once seemed impossible to bring down finally collapsed, and the days that followed became a series of changes Nora had never even dared to dream of. Blackwood and Vance, the name that had once spread fear and stolen everything she'd ever loved, was forced to publicly admit its wrongdoing before the world, issue an official apology to the woman it had so cruelly destroyed, and establish a substantial compensation fund for the losses she'd endured through the years. With that compensation, the very first thing Nora thought about wasn't herself, but Sam's fragile little heart. At last, after so many months of living beneath the invisible clock that had counted down every passing day, the little boy was finally able to undergo the surgery the two of them had once believed was nothing more than a distant dream. The operation was more successful than anyone had expected. When Nora walked into his hospital room and saw healthy color return to his cheeks, heard him softly call her captain, before asking when they could finally go see the real ocean together, she broke into tears. This time they weren't tears of sorrow, but of a happiness she'd waited far too long to experience. As for Dante, the man used this turning point to do something he'd perhaps longed for deep within his heart for years. He seized the opportunity to purge the traitors and rebuild everything he'd created, gradually leading his empire out of the shadows, cutting away its darkest enterprises, and redirecting it toward legitimate businesses, transforming a legacy built upon blood and ruthless calculation into something he could one day leave behind with his head held high. When every storm had finally passed, he went to find Nora. This time, he didn't come carrying wealth or power. He didn't approach her the way he'd once approached an expert, nor did he offer her another act of charity. He came with nothing but sincere respect, asking her to walk beside him not as someone who owed him anything, but as an equal, as someone he cherished with all his heart. He led her onto the balcony of Vittoria's restaurant, overlooking the peaceful Mississippi River, to the very same quiet riverside where she'd once sat alone whenever exhaustion overwhelmed her, dreaming of a different life. There, beneath a sunset that covered the river with liquid gold, he knelt before her and asked her to marry him, with words that were simple, honest, and deeply heartfelt. He promised to love and protect both her and the little boy. He promised that together, they'd build a true home, not another empire. Nora stood there beside the river that had continued flowing through every season of hardship she'd ever known, and suddenly she realized something extraordinary. She was standing inside the very restaurant where she'd once mopped the floors every night, the place where she'd been invisible, someone whose face no one even bothered remembering. Yet now she stood there not with a mop in her hands, but as a free woman, seen, heard, and loved. She nodded her answer, and in that single moment, the circle of fate finally closed completely. Their happiness didn't end with themselves. Together they founded an organization dedicated to helping people who'd been crushed and forgotten by the system, invisible souls just as she'd once been, people of talent and dignity, whose lives had been buried beneath hardship, giving them a chance to stand again and finally be seen. Whenever someone asked her what it felt like to have such a powerful man rescue her life, Nora simply smiled, gently shook her head, and answered that she'd never needed anyone to rescue her. The only thing she'd ever truly longed for was to be seen as a real human being. And now, she wasn't only seen. She was loved. Dear friends, if Nora and Dante's story has touched your heart, please, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with others, so these meaningful stories can continue reaching more people, and so you can enjoy many more unforgettable stories with us each day. How do you feel about Nora's journey from darkness into the light, and about the transformation of a powerful man whose heart learned to beat again because of the sincerity of one extraordinary woman? We'd truly love to hear your thoughts, so please leave your comments below, because your heartfelt reflections mean so much to us. We wish each and every one of you listening today abundant health, lasting happiness, peace, and quiet joy in every day ahead. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in our next video.